There's a moment no one prepares you for. It's not the argument. It's not the goodbye. It's what happens right after. The door closes, the chat goes silent, their name stops lighting up your phone, and suddenly, everything inside you speeds up. Your mind starts replaying the conversation, every word, every pause, every look. You think about what you could have said differently, what you should have clarified, what might have changed the outcome. And then it comes, that urge to send one more message, to explain myself properly, to make sure they understand. You tell yourself it's about closure, about maturity, about leaving things clean. But if you're honest, it's about not wanting to feel dismissed, not wanting to feel replaceable. This is the moment most people lose their power, not because they cared, but because they reacted. They think strength is in the final word. They think dignity is protected by explanation. They think if they just phrase it perfectly, they'll be seen. But Stoicism would challenge that. Epictetus said we are disturbed not by events, but by our judgments about them. The event is simple. Someone left. That's it. But the judgment forms instantly. I need to fix this. I need to be understood. I can't let this end like that. And once that judgment appears, your body follows. Your heart beats faster. Your chest tightens. Silence feels unbearable, not because silence harms you, but because it denies your ego a resolution. Here's the hard truth. The urge to speak again is rarely about clarity. It's about control. Control over how you're remembered. Control over the narrative. Control over whether they see your value. But control in this moment is an illusion. The Stoics never said you shouldn't feel pain. They said you should examine it. Pause before acting. Observe the impulse without obeying it. Ask yourself quietly, am I speaking to preserve dignity or to protect ego? There's a difference. When you speak from urgency, even if your words are correct, they carry instability, and instability weakens influence. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to remain anchored in reason when emotion demanded expression. Not because silence is always right, but because timing gives words their weight. Most people trade long-term respect for short-term relief. They send the message, they explain everything, they defend themselves, and for a few minutes, they feel lighter. But later, they replay that too. Silence in this moment is not weakness, it is discipline. It is choosing not to argue with reality. Someone made a decision. You do not chase a decision with persuasion. You meet it with composure. Here's something most people don't realize. People don't remember the last speech. They remember patterns. They remember how you carried yourself over time. Were you reactive or steady? Did you demand to be understood? Or did you stand firm without explanation? The final words fade. Character remains. So, in this first quiet moment, your job is not to repair the ending. Your job is to guard your inner order. Can you sit with misunderstanding without correcting it immediately? Can you feel the surge of explanation and let it pass? Can you allow silence without trying to fill it? Stoicism does not promise that silence will bring them back. It does not guarantee regret. It offers something more solid: alignment. When you choose restraint over reaction, you stabilize the only thing you control, yourself. The door has closed, the impulse has risen. Now the real work begins. Not out there, in here. Silence is not weakness. Most people misunderstand that. When someone walks away and you choose not to chase them, not to send the long explanation, not to defend your name, it doesn't mean you don't care. It means you are choosing discipline over impulse, and that is much harder. After the first wave of emotion passes, something uncomfortable shows up. You start thinking, maybe I should say something. Maybe they misunderstood me. Maybe if I just clarify one more thing. That voice feels logical, but look closer. It's not logic. It's ego trying to secure relevance. Stoicism teaches something most people never practice: restraint. Not suppression, not coldness, restraint. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to remain steady when misunderstood. not because misunderstanding feels good, but because reacting to every misunderstanding destroys inner order. When you speak from urgency, even if your words are correct, they carry instability, and instability weakens presence. Here's the truth. If your character is strong, you do not need to perform strength. If you are grounded, you don't need to prove that you are grounded. Silence becomes powerful when it is not used to punish someone, but to protect your own nervous system. Think about this. Every time you reopen the conversation, you reopen the emotional loop. Every explanation invites another counter-explanation. Every defense invites another challenge. And suddenly, you are no longer moving forward. You are negotiating the past. Silence stops the negotiation. It says, without drama, I will not argue with reality. Someone made a choice. You don't chase a choice with persuasion. You meet it with composure. Now, this is where it gets uncomfortable. Silence gives you no immediate feedback. You don't know if they notice. You don't know if they care. You don't know what they think. And your ego hates that uncertainty. But Stoicism was never about controlling perception. It was about governing yourself. Can you stay composed without applause? Can you remain grounded without being validated? That's discipline. And over time, something shifts. You stop checking. You stop explaining silence to yourself. You stop rehearsing imaginary conversations. Your energy consolidates. You feel less scattered, more anchored. Your tone changes. Your boundaries hold without argument. Not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because you are no longer reacting. Silence practiced correctly does not shrink you. It refines you. It removes performance. It removes urgency. It removes the need to win the final exchange. And here's the quiet part no one talks about. When you choose discipline over reaction, you will never look back and regret saying too little. But many people regret saying too much. So, if silence feels heavy right now, good. That weight is discipline forming. That discomfort is your ego losing control. Stay there. Let the silence build your stability instead of trying to break it. Because once you can hold silence without needing to fill it, you've already regained your power. Now let's go deeper. Silence is the beginning, but the next level is becoming unreachable. And I don't mean blocking someone in anger. I don't mean disappearing to make a point. I don't mean playing games. I mean something quieter, something internal. Most people think they've moved on because they stopped talking, but inside, they are still reachable. A name appears on the screen. Heart rate changes. They hear a small update. Mood shifts. They imagine what the other person is thinking, and suddenly their entire emotional state depends on it. That is not distance. That is attachment without contact. Stoicism teaches that attention is power. Where your attention goes, your energy follows. If your mind is still monitoring, still anticipating, still replaying, then you are still accessible. Becoming unreachable means withdrawing emotional access. It means your peace is no longer open for negotiation. You may still exist in the same world, same circles, same digital spaces, but your nervous system is no longer waiting, no longer scanning, no longer reacting. This is not coldness. This is sovereignty. Epictetus taught that we suffer not because of events, but because we attach meaning to them. When you become unreachable, you stop attaching meaning to signals that no longer deserve interpretation. A post is just a post. A delay is just a delay. Silence is just silence. You stop decoding everything, and that is freedom. Now, listen carefully. When someone can still trigger you easily, they still have influence. When their smallest action changes your mood, they still have access. But when you no longer respond internally, even if you remain polite externally, the dynamic changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. They sense something different. Messages lose leverage. Familiar phrases don't land the same way. Buttons that used to work stop working. And you didn't announce this change. You simply stopped participating. Stoicism does not call this punishment. It calls this conservation. Your emotional energy is limited. Why give it to situations that are no longer aligned with your values? Why keep rehearsing conversations with people who are no longer present? Becoming unreachable is not about making them feel your absence. It's about no longer feeling the pull. That's the shift. When you stop explaining your silence to yourself, when you stop wondering if they noticed, when you stop checking whether your absence is working, you are no longer playing the same game. You are no longer negotiating your value. Your peace becomes structured, and structure creates stability. Over time, this is often when realization happens on the other side. Not because you tried to cause it, not because you engineered distance, but because influence is gone. And influence is usually only noticed when it disappears. So ask yourself something honestly. If your phone never lit up again, would your emotional state collapse? If the answer is yes, you are still reachable. If the answer is no, you are free. Unreachability is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is simply this: your peace is no longer dependent on their behavior. And once that becomes true, you stop trying to be remembered. You start becoming untouchable. There is something very uncomfortable about waiting. After loss, after silence, after you've stopped reacting, the mind still wants something: an apology, a realization, a moment where everything is acknowledged. But Stoicism teaches something difficult. Clarity does not come from pressure. It comes from time. Most people try to force understanding too early. They want resolution while emotions are still hot. They want fairness while pride is still active. They want recognition while ego is still defending itself. But when emotion is high, perception is distorted. Anything said in that state is filtered through defensiveness. So the Stoic does something radical. They step back, not because they don't care, but because they understand timing. Time removes distortion. Time reveals patterns. When weeks pass, when months pass, people begin comparing. They compare who you were to who you are not anymore. They compare the stability that once existed to the instability that replaced it. Words argue, time demonstrates, and demonstration is stronger than argument. In the moment of separation, both sides are emotional. Pride is loud, relief might feel empowering, distance might feel justified, but emotions shift. When the intensity fades, reality becomes clearer. This is where time does its work. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. If you remained composed, if you did not chase, if you did not create chaos, that contrast grows heavier over time. People begin to notice what is missing, not because you reminded them, but because absence creates comparison, and comparison creates awareness. Stoicism is deeply practical here. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about allowing events to unfold according to nature. That means not interfering with the natural consequences of choices. When someone chooses distance, let distance reveal its meaning. When someone chooses separation, let separation teach its lesson. You do not rush that process. You do not monitor it. You do not wait for it, because the moment you start watching for regret, you are emotionally tied again. Letting time speak also protects you. If you revisit the past too early, you reopen wounds that were just beginning to close. If you demand clarity before someone has grown, you invite confusion again. Time breaks emotional loops. It recalibrates the nervous system. What once felt urgent becomes optional. What once felt unbearable becomes instructive. And here is the paradox. Regret, if it appears at all, usually arrives after you have stopped waiting for it. When your focus returns to your own life, when your routines stabilize, when your identity no longer depends on being remembered, time begins to work without your involvement. You do not see the moment it happens. You do not hear it announced, but realization forms in silence, not because you argued your value, but because your absence allowed comparison. And comparison is a teacher that does not need your voice. So let time speak, not as revenge, not as strategy, but as patience. Because when you stop trying to control the outcome, you give reality space to reveal what words never could. Now we reach a turning point, because silence, detachment, and time mean nothing if you are not changing internally. This is where many people make a mistake. They try to look better, post better, seem stronger. But Stoicism does not care how you look. It cares how you regulate. There is a big difference. Leveling up emotionally is not about appearing healed. It is about responding differently when triggered. It is about shortening your recovery time. It is about feeling anger without sending the message, feeling sadness without collapsing into it, feeling longing without acting on it impulsively. That is growth. And it is invisible at first. The world may not see it, but your nervous system does. In the past, a small reminder of them could ruin your entire day. Now it passes. In the past, misunderstanding would provoke a long explanation. Now you let it sit. In the past, silence felt like rejection. Now it feels neutral. That shift is emotional elevation. The Stoics never taught suppression. They taught examination. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Emotional leveling up means catching imagination before it spirals. It means asking yourself, is this fact or interpretation? And then choosing your response carefully. Here's something most people don't realize. Public transformation is often still tied to external validation. Even when it looks confident, when you level up emotionally in private, there is no audience, no applause, no feedback, just discipline. And discipline builds stability. Over time, people notice something, but they can't quite name it. You don't react the same way. You don't argue the same way. You don't chase the same way. Your tone is calmer. Your boundaries are firmer, not aggressive, not defensive, just steady. And steadiness is powerful because it is rare. Emotional maturity changes how others experience you. When volatility disappears, so does drama. When drama disappears, so does leverage. People can only manipulate reactions that still exist. When the reaction fades, the dynamic shifts. But understand this clearly, you are not leveling up to be admired. You are leveling up to be aligned. Aligned with your values, aligned with your standards, aligned with your peace. When your inner responses become measured, your external life becomes cleaner, less chaos, less negotiation, less emotional debt. Stoicism calls this self-command, not domination over others, command over yourself. And once you master that, you stop needing to prove resilience. You start living it. So instead of asking, how do I look now? Ask yourself, how do I respond now? Because that answer determines whether you've truly grown. And growth, when real, never needs to be announced. It is felt, first by you, and eventually by everyone else. Now we come to the final shift. This is where everything either settles or secretly stays attached. You can be silent, you can detach, you can regulate your emotions, but if you are still waiting for an outcome, you are not free yet. Stoicism calls this attachment to result, the need to see justice, the need to see regret, the need to see realization happen visibly, and that need keeps you tied to the past. Amor fati, love of fate, not tolerance, not resignation, love. It means this: whatever unfolded was part of your path, not because it felt good, not because it was fair, but because it shaped you. When you release the outcome, you stop demanding that life explain itself to you. You stop insisting that someone arrive at awareness on your timeline. You stop watching, and that is the moment peace stabilizes. Most people say they've moved on, but secretly, they are still scanning for signs, still checking for hints of regret, still imagining future encounters. That is not movement, that is waiting in disguise. To truly release the outcome means you no longer need the story to resolve in your favor. You no longer need to witness their realization. You no longer need closure to feel complete. Marcus Aurelius wrote about accepting what nature brings. That includes endings. That includes misunderstanding. That includes being forgotten. Because your dignity does not depend on memory, it depends on conduct. When you release outcome, your energy returns to the present. Your sleep improves. Your focus sharpens. Your direction clarifies. You stop investing in imaginary futures, and you start building real ones. Here's the paradox. If regret forms anywhere, you won't see it, because you won't be looking back. And if it never forms, it won't matter, because you are no longer measuring your value through someone else's recognition. That is freedom. The Stoics would not call this victory. They would call it alignment. You acted with restraint. You preserved your character. You maintained self-command. Life unfolds from there. No forcing, no chasing, no performing, just forward motion. Not dramatic, not loud, steady. And when you walk forward without checking behind you, the past loses its authority. What remains is your path, your discipline, your peace. And that is something no one can walk away with.